Hello and welcome to the wonderful world of cell respiration and a little bit on how it relates to photosynthesis, which is in a different video. So if you want to review a little photosynthesis, you can go back to that video and then continue on with this one. So photosynthesis is when carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight combine to create sugar and oxygen. This only happens in plant cells. We, as in humans, and any animal, do not have chlorophyll and the organelle chloroplast in order to do photosynthesis. So we actually have to consume our energy, whereas they are able to use the sunlight for their energy. So notice carbon dioxide, water, sunlight makes sugar, glucose, and oxygen. So what happens in cell respiration is that glucose and oxygen combine and form carbon dioxide, water, and energy, or ATP. Now, if you think about sunlight is actually a form of energy, light energy, and then ATP is chemical energy. So when we eat our food that sometimes was made from plants, sometimes from animals that ate plants, it eventually goes back to those plants, we take it in and make our own energy out of it and breathe out carbon dioxide and produce water in order for our energy to be made and that we can use to run or do various other things. And so therefore they are actually opposite reactions. So notice photosynthesis makes glucose and oxygen, cell respiration uses that glucose and oxygen, and then we produce, or cell respiration produces carbon dioxide and water and energy, and that's what the actual plants need to make your glucose and oxygen. So they are completely opposite reactions. So it kind of brings in the whole ecology of we need plants, plants need us deal. We can't live without each other. So there are a few different types of respiration though. Photosynthesis, there was just one pathway. Respiration, there are two. They are known as anaerobic and aerobic. You might have heard of these in terms of exercise, and there's always anaerobic performance and aerobic performance. And it all has to deal with whether there's oxygen involved or not. So if you look at that picture, which body is best for health and performance? Well, it depends on what you're looking for. Picture on the left, they are very aerobic. Their muscles have a lot of mitochondria in them so that they can go through aerobic, whereas the person on the right has a lot of bigger muscles, which is more of an anaerobic, so they're able to push through without much oxygen. So now we're going to look at what each type of respiration actually means. But first, before we do that, we want to look at the organelle that is in charge of this whole thing, and that is called the mitochondria. It has two membranes. The outer membrane determines what goes in and out of the mitochondria, and then the inner membrane is for the electron transport chain and actually where ATP, which is our energy source, is made. And it has a whole bunch of enzymes. And then on the very inside, you have what's known as the matrix. It's very similar to the cytoplasm, but it has specific enzymes for what's known as a Krebs cycle. So the mitochondria is basically the powerhouse of your cell. It makes your energy. So it is very, very important to your cell respiration. And then the last piece of the mitochondria, you have the intermembrane space, which is in between the two membranes, and this is going to be super important when we talk about the electron transport chain because it creates a gradient. It's a place that they can throw these hydrogen ions and create what's known as a gradient, a concentration gradient. They can put a whole bunch of them inside the intermembrane space so that they can move through the inner membrane. But more on that later. So first step in both processes, aerobic and anaerobic, is what's known as glycolysis. Now it's the lysis of glucose. So it's basically cuts glucose into 2-pyruvic acid, which allows glucose to be able to actually get into the mitochondria. Because if you remember transport systems, if things are too big, they can't move through membranes. So glycolysis allows glucose to actually be able to fit through the membrane and get into the mitochondria. So as you see, you have a glucose. You actually have to add energy to make it into fructose 1,6 biphosphate, which isn't super important, but that is what is able to break into 2-p-gals, which eventually will make your pyruvates. And in that process, they actually make 4 ATP and then 2 NADHs, which might sound familiar. NADPHs are in plants for photosynthesis, but NADH has the same reason. It's the electron carrier for cell respiration. And notice that 4 ATP are made. So if you have to put 2 ATP in and you get 4 ATP out, you have a total gain of 2 ATP in the process of glycolysis. So even though you have to put in some energy to get some energy out, you have a net overall gain. It's kind of like when you have to put in money to get to sell it for something that's more expensive, then you actually get a gain of money. Same idea. So now what actually happens to those pyruvates is it has to make a decision. If there's no oxygen, it goes through what the process known as fermentation or anaerobic respiration. If there is oxygen, it goes through aerobic respiration. So we're going to break down what each one of those is. So first, anaerobic, there's 2 pathways, and it actually determined by what organism you are. So lactic acid and alcoholic fermentation. Lactic acid is what we go through. You might have heard of lactic acid buildup, and then alcoholic is what yeast goes through, and that's actually how we make our beer and wine, because it produces an ethanol. So in this picture you'll see glucose, the top part is actually glycolysis. Glucose is broken down into 2 pyruvates, and ATP is given off as well as NADH. Then, because there's no oxygen present, what's going to happen to these yeast is they're going to give off some carbon dioxide and take those NADHs and regenerate them or give them back and produce 2-ethanol. So you'll notice not a single ATP is made in the second part of anaerobic respiration, but the purpose of it is so that the glycolysis can continue, because without fermentation, glycolysis will shut down. And then lactic acid, the major difference is instead of ethanol, it actually makes lactic acid, and no carbon dioxide is produced. So we go through lactic acid. This is way less efficient than aerobic, but if we are deprived of oxygen, this at least gives us some ATP and some energy so we can survive for a little bit. Now, aerobic is a lot more efficient, but you have to have oxygen. So if you've been running for a very long time or sprinting really fast for a short amount of time, you're going to start at some point going through anaerobic. But at the beginning, you want to maintain aerobic respiration. There are 2 parts to aerobic. There is the Krebs cycle and the ETC, or the electron transport chain. Now we're going to focus on what goes in and out of these 2 processes instead of the whole every step in the process. So in the Krebs cycle, basically you put in the pyruvate that is made in glycolysis, and you get out the NADH, FADH2, which is basically the same thing as NADH, and some ATP. And then it moves on to the ETC, which is found in that inner membrane. And what happens in the electron transport chain is those NADH and FADH2 from before are used to make a lot of ATP. Lots of ATP. Now, aerobic makes a lot more, and it's because of this last step, the electron transport chain. But this is also where water is used. Oxygen is used to make water. So without oxygen, the electron transport chain does not function. So that's why this is only part of aerobic respiration. So just to look at the general pathway, you have glucose that goes through glycolysis, which breaks the glucose down into pyruvic acid. If there's no oxygen, it goes through fermentation, which you have lactic acid or alcoholic. If there is oxygen, it goes to aerobic respiration, which has 2 parts, the Krebs cycle and electron transport chain. And notice in fermentation, you make a lot less ATP. Aerobic respiration, a lot more ATP. And this is why when you are exercising, you want to stay in aerobic respiration mode for as long as possible, because you get a lot more ATP. once you've gone into the anaerobic, you're going to boink or basically fall apart and lose energy pretty quickly. Now, your cells can go through, your muscle cells, some can be going through anaerobic while others are going through aerobic and flip back and forth, but you want to maintain majority of them going through aerobic for as long as possible. And that's actually why you train, so that your muscles get used to and are able to go through aerobic. So overall, the process of cell respiration is to break down sugar for energy. And you have the two possibilities, the anaerobic and aerobic, which is all due to the oxygen. And as you see on the picture, chloroplasts and mitochondria basically give each other what the other needs. They're opposite reactions, which is kind of the culminating aspect of this whole unit. Is it's the transfer of energy from sunlight to plants to animals. And it all has to do with that carbohydrate, glucose, which will give us energy. But unfortunately, we can't just take light energy. We have to use the chemical energy of carbohydrates. So this all relates to various aspects of your body, the circulatory system, the respiratory system, and that's where we're going to end up with this. But in cell respiration, it's how you get energy. And now when you're going out for a run or going to play a sport, you'll realize your breathing is super important in order to maintain that aerobic respiration.